the man known to history as King Henry III, was born on the 1st of October 1207 in Winchester Castle in Hampshire, in the south of England. He is often referred to as Henry of Winchester in reference to his birthplace at this royal residence. His father was King John I of England, who had ruled over the country since 1199. John had succeeded to large territories beyond England in France and Ireland, but, as we will see presently, owing to his weak rule, what has been referred to as the Angevin Empire of the 12th century kings of England was in decline by the early 13th century. Henry's mother was Queen Isabella of Angoulême. She had married John in 1200 when she was still just a teenager, and it was perhaps because of her youth, but the marriage did not produce children until Henry was born 7 years later. He would be the first of 5 children born in quick succession. Henry's younger brother Richard arrived in January 1209, while 3 girls, Joan, Isabella, and Eleanor, were born in 1210, 1214, and 1215. Little is known about Henry's early years. He was raised by his mother and a wet nurse by the name of Ellen Dunn, whom he later provided an ample pension to. In 1212, when he was 5 years old, Henry's education was entrusted to the Bishop of Winchester, Peter de Roche, an arrangement which would last for the better part of the next decade. De Roche was evidently well picked, and by the time he was 9 years old, Henry was said to be an individual who spoke with a certain gravitas already, and had been instilled with a reverence for his Angevin forebears, a necessity in an individual whose duty would be to uphold the might of the royal family. And it was also probably as a result of his having been educated by de Roche that Henry acquired the piety and religious sensibilities which he would display later in his life. Yet, there were others involved in his upbringing as well. For instance, a bodyguard of Henry's, Ralph of St. Sampson, taught him to ride a horse, while Philip d'Aubigny, a Breton retainer of de Roche, attempted to train Henry from an early age in the art of war. It has also been suggested that it was while he was under de Roche's tutelage that Henry's reverence for the cult of the saints first emerged. This childhood would soon be interrupted, however. Much of Henry's long reign was shaped by the actions of his father. John had risen to the throne of England in 1199 after years of scheming against his own brother, King Richard I. When Richard was killed in 1199 without an heir, it facilitated John's rise. That was a disaster for the royal line. During the 12th century, the kings of England controlled much of France, notably the Duchy of Normandy in the north of the country, and other regions such as the County Anjou and parts of Gascony and Aquitaine in the south and west of France. However, when John went to war with France in 1202, he quickly managed to alienate his French nobles, and then a series of catastrophic military setbacks against King Philip II of France resulted in the loss of much of the royal family's lands in northern France, which had been joined with England since the Norman conquest in the mid-11th century. The loss of these in 1204 was a humiliation for John, and his relationship with his own nobility in England was declining as well in the years that followed. Both these factors, the relationship with England's nobility and the loss of much of the Angevin territories in France, would cast long shadows over Henry's reign. These disturbances peaked shortly before Henry became King of England, and in 1214, John was back at war with King Philip II of France. But the cost of trying to reclaim Normandy and the other lost territory was effectively being shouldered by the English nobility in the shape of higher taxes. Their concerns about this were compounded when John's forces were badly defeated at the Battle of Bouvard in Flanders in July 1214, scuppering England's chances of recovering its French territories. As a result of this, a number of English nobles led by the first Earl of Winchester, Sir de Quincey, and Robert Fitzwater initiated a rebellion against John which came to be known as the First Barons' War. Initially, John was inclined to be conciliatory, and on the 15th of June 1215 he met with the leaders of the rebellion at Runnymede near Windsor and agreed to the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, a document in which John acknowledged both the rights of the lords and the fact that there were limitations on John's ability to raise taxes and interfere in the church and the lives of the nobility. The Magna Carta has since been viewed as a critical moment in the evolution of England's political system, a document which effectively restricted the power of the monarchy, but at the time it was quickly dispensed with by John, who, having agreed to it originally, subsequently believed he was in a strong enough position to crush the revolt militarily. A highly unusual situation then developed. For decades, the kings of France have been forced to contend with England interfering in French affairs. Now, instead, France would intervene in England as the English barons petitioned Prince Louis, the son of King Philip of France, for support against John. Louis promptly invaded England in the early summer of 1216. John panicked and fled to Winchester, leaving London largely undefended for Louis's armies to occupy. After which, the French prince was even proclaimed as King of England by the English rebels. Over the next weeks, the situation became extremely precarious for John and by extension, for his young heir, Henry. But then John contracted dysentery and died in October 1216. Suddenly, the English nobles who were in revolt abandoned Prince Louis and began switching their allegiance to Henry. Thus it was that John's son, who had just turned 9 years of age days before his father's death, became King of England. John's death created a situation whereby the English barons and nobles could now reconcile themselves to the crown, and Prince Louis suddenly found himself being abandoned by the very individuals who just weeks earlier had been proposing to make him King of England. As a 9-year-old, Henry could not rule in his own right in 1216, nor would he do so for many years to come. Instead, a regency government was quickly established to rule on his behalf, and in the first years of the reign, this was principally headed by the Earl of Pembroke, William Marshal, a leading English noble whom John had appointed to head his son's government on his deathbed. Marshal was extremely capable, and in the first months following John's death, he succeeded in winning over the majority of the English nobles who had been in rebellion. There then followed 2 notable military victories. In mid-May, Marshal won a major battle against the French forces at the Battle of Lincoln, while in late August an English fleet under Hubert de Burgh succeeded in defeating the French at sea. With further support from France largely cut off, Louis agreed to peace negotiations. Through the Treaty of Lambeth, which was concluded in September 1217, Louis agreed to renounce his claims to the English throne in return for a substantial payment, while Henry's government largely agreed to implement and honor the terms of the Magna Carta. With this, the First Barons' War was brought to an end, stabilizing Henry's reign after the chaos created by his father. There was now a considerable amount of work to be done by Marshal and the other senior figures within the Regency government to begin restoring the royal position in England and strengthening the Crown's authority in order to try to reassert its position in France in the years ahead. While the events of 1217 had ended the revolt of Henry's nobles, they remained fractious and difficult to control, knowing that the government's position was weak. Moreover, Marshal's Regency government was desperately short of money, and it was also facing unrest in Wales, where Prince Llewellyn of Gwynedd had gained a great degree of autonomy over the country during the turbulent years of the First Barons' War. To assuage the latter problem, the Treaty of Worcester was negotiated with Llewellyn in 1218, whereby the Welsh prince was effectively recognized in some of the lands he had claimed in years gone by. It was not an ideal situation, but it served to pacify Wales while the Crown was restoring its rule over England. With this achieved, Marshal had at least ended the conflicts which faced his young king, But it would take many years for the crown to return to a full position of strength. The securing of that stability was to be Marshall's last achievement, as he died on the 14th of May 1219. The issue of the regency government was debated at a conference which was held at Oxford just weeks after Marshall's death. Here it was determined that a triumvirate of individuals would take over. Peter de Roche, as Henry's tutor, would play a prominent role, as would the papal legate to England, Pando Ferraccio. But the foremost figure from 1219 onwards was the justiciar Hubert de Burgh. In the years that followed, he gradually began monopolizing ever greater amounts of power until, by 1222, he was the unrivaled head of the regency government. But his tenure was also successful. By the end of 1223, he had retaken much of Llewellyn's territories in Wales and re-established crown rule there, while he was also able to begin introducing new crown taxes in the mid-1220s, measures which began to restore the crown's finances to some extent, although it was still largely beholden to the nobility in this. Finally, in 1226, de Burgh began the long and arduous task of trying to reclaim some of the English territories in France, which John had lost 20 years earlier, and that year, an English expedition recaptured the province of Gascony in the southwest of France. By now, Henry was nearing the end of his teenage years. As a result, on the 8th of January 1227, 3 months after turning 19, he convened a council of the nobility and his officials at Oxford. Here, he declared that he was now of full age and intended to rule in his own right. However, while this event was to be viewed as an official end to the regency government, Henry continued to allow Hubert de Burgh to effectively run the government for many years to come. Indeed, the king acknowledged the paramount position of de Burgh among his subjects by elevating him to the peerage as the first Earl of Kent very soon after the council at Oxford. Then, in April 1228, de Burgh was granted the office of justiciar for life, a peculiar arrangement which highlighted how weak the young king's position remained. By 1229, there were signs that Henry was trying to assert his independence from the former regent, but even Hubert's bungling of an attempted military campaign in France to recover Normandy at the end of the 1220s could not induce Henry to make a clean break with de Burgh. In the end, what would finally start to weaken Hubert's position was not any concerted action by Henry himself, but the return of Peter de Roche, Henry's childhood tutor, to England after several years in the Holy Land as part of the Sixth Crusade. Henry III would have hunted in the forests and woods of England. To recreate this experience, wanna try Hunting Clash, the sponsor of this video, and a realistic hunting game which features cutting-edge graphics and addictive gameplay. We think playing the game is like being on safari with all the excitement and none of the danger. It really is a lot of fun, and with Hunting Clash, it's always hunting season. This spectacular, realistic animal hunting simulator and shooting game is free and available on iOS and Android. Use the gift code HUNTWITHPEOPLE to get 100 gold, 70 skills tokens to upgrade your preferred skill and get more points when hunting. 1 mythical lure from the grizzly bear in Montana so you can hunt bigger animals. 1 mythical lure from the mountain lion in Montana so you can hunt bigger animals. All this for a total value of $15. To redeem your gift code, follow 3 simple steps. This offer is only available for new players. Click the link in the description to download Hunting Clash and support the channel. Use our gift code to get $15 worth of gifts for new players only. The return of de Roche to England in 1231 led to a dramatic shift in the power relations at Henry's court. In January 1232, de Roche was appointed as a Baron of the Exchequer, placing him in charge of much of the finances of the kingdom. With this newfound power, he was able to begin undermining de Burgh and, in particular, his ability to raise taxes for a renewed campaign in France. Then, in June, de Roche's cousin, Peter de Rivali, was appointed as treasurer of Henry's household. It was all a clear sign that de Roche's faction was in the ascendant and de Burgh was losing ground. It cannot have come as a surprise to many when, just weeks later, in July 1232, Henry split fully with de Burgh on the back of rumors that the justiciar intended to interfere in church affairs. Yet, while Henry was nearing his 25th year, long past the apt time for him to assert himself fully as king, the removal of de Burgh in the summer of 1232 did not immediately lead Henry to begin ruling in his own right. Rather, the events of 1232 simply led to a new government being dominated by de Roche and his faction. This situation would last for 2 years, and it was only in the summer of 1234, after Henry was urged by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund of Abingdon, to end his reliance on powerful advisors, that the king plucked up the courage to dismiss de Roche and dismantle his faction at court. Finally, at 26 years of age, Henry III would begin to rule in his own right. One of the first issues to be resolved at this juncture was Henry's continuing status as a bachelor. Various marriage negotiations have been conducted since the late 1220s, but none had resulted in a betrothal. By the mid-1230s, Henry was entering what was deemed to be middle age at the time, and the necessity of producing an heir was now paramount. Early in 1235, he proposed to Jean, heir of the county of Poitou in France, but King Louis IX of France, who wished to scupper a possible union between Poitou and the English crown, intervened with Pope Gregory IX to have Rome block the union. Unperturbed, Henry quickly established negotiations with the Count of Provence in southern France, Raymond Berengar, proposing to marry his 11-year-old daughter, Eleanor. It was a curious match. On account of her age, it would be several years before Eleanor would be able to bear Henry an heir, while her father was not a wealthy French lord, and the dowry which was brought to the marriage was very small. However, the Provence match did provide diplomatic benefits, as Raymond controlled the important passes over the Alps between southern France and northern Italy, while Eleanor's older sister was married to King Louis IX of France, and the union consequently worked to establish a more firm peace with Louis, who now became Henry's brother-in-law. Henry and Eleanor were married at Westminster on the 20th of January 1236. Despite their age difference, in time they would develop a relationship of genuine affection, although it was not without its problems. Eleanor arrived in England with her own household of figures from southern France. One of these, William of Savoy, soon rose to become an influential government minister, and resentment emerged amongst the English nobility in the years that followed over the alleged influence of the French faction at Henry's court, although there certainly was no repetition of the factional dominance which de Roche had exercised in the early 1230s. And what was perhaps more important was that the marriage soon produced children and an heir. In the summer of 1239, Henry and Eleanor's first child, the future King Edward I, was born. 2 girls, Margaret and Beatrice, followed in quick succession in 1240 and 1242, before a second son, Edmund, arrived in 1245. A fifth and final child, Catherine, was born many years later in 1253, but she suffered from an illness, the exact nature of which is unclear, and died when she was just 3 years old. The surviving children, as will be seen, would go on to play significant roles in English political affairs throughout Henry's later reign. The changed circumstances of the mid to late 1230s also witnessed the emergence of a much altered royal court. In addition to the arrival of several French officials as part of Eleanor's household, Henry began promoting a generation of courtiers who did not have previous links to the old factions of de Burgh and de Roche, and with whom he could make a clean break. These included individuals such as William de Cantilupe, 2nd Baron of Eaton Bray, whom Henry appointed as Sheriff of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, Sir Bertram de Creel, who served as warden of the Cinque Ports and keeper of Dover Castle from the mid-1230s onwards, and Sir John Monsell, who eventually became the Lord Chancellor. There was also a place of prominence afforded to Edmund, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had implored the king to make a break from de Roche a few years earlier. Nevertheless, mindful of ending any residual elements of faction at court, Henry eventually offered pardons to both de Roche and de Burgh in 1238 and 1243 before their deaths, and rehabilitated some of their associates in the years that followed. In this way, Henry neutralized several possible opponents and created a more stable court system in the 1230s and early 1240s, in which no individual was more powerful than himself. The first years of Henry's direct rule also saw a highly important arrangement reached between England and Scotland. Most kings of England all the way back to William the Conqueror, and indeed subsequent to Henry's reign all the way down to the mid-16th century, engaged in conflict with England's northern neighbour. Henry took a different approach. The King of Scotland, Alexander II, had married Henry's sister Joan in 1221. Anxious to expand the opportunities made available by this arrangement, early in 1237, Henry instructed his officials to organize a meeting with Alexander at York in the north of England. There, on the 25th of September 1237, an agreement known as the Treaty of York was arrived at. This fixed the border between England and Scotland, as Alexander relinquished any claims which the Scottish throne had previously had to the counties of Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland. Thereafter, Henry's relationship with Alexander and his successor Alexander III, who ascended in 1249, remained very amicable. He even married his daughter Margaret to Alexander III in 1251. Perhaps more consequentially, the Treaty of York established, with only some minor revisions of the interim, the border between England and Scotland down to the present day. While Henry was scoring this diplomatic success on the Scottish border, trouble was brewing in England itself, and it came in the shape of Henry's younger brother. Richard of Cornwall was resentful of his reduced role in political affairs following the arrival of the French coterie around Eleanor in the mid-1230s. He had tried to provoke unrest amongst the English nobility at this time, but this challenge was seen off when Henry's advisors, led by William of Savoy, called a council at Westminster in 1237 where, amongst other initiatives, the Magna Carta was reaffirmed. Nevertheless, within a year, Richard was once again making clear his unhappiness at the course of events. The issue which provoked his anger now was revelations that Simon de Montfort, a French-born courtier, had begun a clandestine relationship with Henry and Richard's widowed sister Eleanor. Henry's response when he discovered this was to try to reduce the scandal by organizing a secret marriage between Simon and Eleanor in January 1238. However, Richard was unwilling to accept this and saw in de Montfort's marriage to Eleanor the emergence of a new faction, headed by French figures such as Simon and William of Savoy. While he was wrong in his assessment of the influence of the French faction, the result was the same. In the spring of 1238, Henry was faced with a new rebellion, one led by his own brother. The rebellion of 1238 was soon joined by several other prominent English nobles, notably the 4th Earl of Pembroke, Gilbert Marshall, the son of Henry's old guardian, William Marshall, and the 2nd Earl of Winchester, Robert de Quincy. They managed to drum up considerable support by arguing to the political community that the marriage of the king's sister to a French newcomer should not have been undertaken in secret, without prior consultation with the leading magnates of England. And it must be remembered that this was at a time when Henry did not, as yet, have an heir. So any marriage of a royal family member was a matter of some political significance. Henry met Richard and his followers in arms at Stratford-le-Bow outside London in late February, but determined not to engage in battle and retreated back to the Tower of London. Political guile instead worked to calm the situation. Richard had been keen to lead a crusade to the Holy Land for some time, emulating his and Henry's uncle, Richard the Lionheart, and Henry now provided him with 16,000 marks to pay for this. Thus, in 1240, Richard left for the Holy Land, where his only major success was in refortifying Ascalon for the Christian cause. Meanwhile, William of Savoy left for the continent in the early summer of 1238 and never returned to England, pacifying much of the unease about the growing influence of the Queen's French councillors at Henry's court. In the years that followed, the Jewish community of England became a matter of increasing preoccupation at court. As elsewhere in medieval Europe, the Jewish people were an oppressed part of the population in England. For Christians of the time, this was deemed acceptable because they believed that the Jews had committed deicide, the act of killing God, in calling for Jesus to be crucified by the Romans in the days before his death and resurrection. Thus, in contrast to modern anti-Semitism, which has typically focused more on conspiracy theories about the Jewish people trying to control society, medieval anti-Semitism was based on the interpretation of the New Testament. Communities of Jewish settlers first arrived in England in the 11th century and experienced persecution in the 12th century. However, as the Crown's financial position was so weak in the early 13th century, it introduced several policies to benefit the Jewish population, which had an outsized role in money lending, as Judaism did not prohibit usury in contrast to Christianity. Henry continued these policies in the 1230s and 1240s, but he also tried to develop a policy of actively looking to convert England's Jewish people to Roman Catholicism by setting up and patronizing the Domus Conversorum in London, meaning the House of the Converts. It is estimated that as much as 10% of the Jewish population in England had converted by the 1250s, but the Crown's Jewish policy, as we will see, became more hostile later in Henry's reign. Henry's approach towards Wales during the early days of his personal reign was substantially determined by the death of Prince Llewellyn there in 1240. Deprived of its strongest leader, the Welsh nobility was not as coordinated in resisting English interference in the years that followed, and 3 bouts of military campaigning in the 1240s allowed Henry to re-establish English control over the country in a way which had not been possible for much of the 13th century up to that point. In particular, northern Wales was brought firmly under Henry's jurisdiction by expanding the county of Chester on its eastern border and by erecting a chain of new castles across the north. Eventually, an arrangement was reached with Llewellyn's sons, Owen and Llewellyn, whereby they will be allowed to exercise a degree of self-rule in their core lands of Gwynedd and Western Wales, in return for ending their efforts to secure control over the rest of northern Wales. This aside, much of the south of Wales remained largely outside of the control of the English crown, and it would fall to Henry's successor, Edward I, several decades later, to reassert full English control over Wales. Part of the reason why Henry could not impose his rule in Wales as successfully as he might otherwise have wanted was because his resources were yet again directed to France at this time. Henry's mother, Isabella, had still been a young woman when John I died in 1216, and in 1220 she married Hugh of Lusignan, the Count of La Marche in northern France. Hugh was subject to King Louis IX of France, but in 1242 he and several other French lords rebelled against the French king and his brother Alphonse, who was the Count of Poitou. Henry now sided with these French lords of Poitou and the surrounding region, and went to war with the French in a brief conflict known as the Saintonge War. But the campaign into France quickly turned disastrous for Henry. At the Battle of Taillebourg in July 1242, the king and his Poitevin allies were surrounded by the French, and Henry only escaped because his brother Richard was able to acquire a day's reprieve from any attacks, on the strength of his having just returned from a crusade to the Holy Land. The setback effectively allowed Louis to crush the revolt in Poitou, while Henry headed back to England, having spent £80,000 on a pointless campaign which had done nothing but arouse the enmity of certain members of his court, chief amongst them being the Frenchman Simon de Montfort. The setback of the Saintonge War was not corrected in the years that followed in France. The money which Henry had squandered in trying to support the rebels in Poitou ensured that he could not afford an active approach towards recovering his French territories for much of the 1240s. Moreover, King Louis of France was one of the strongest rulers of his kingdom to emerge in decades. As a result, the remainder of the 1240s actually saw Henry's relations among the Lusignans of Poitou and La Marche actually leaving France, as Louis extended his control over their region of the country. Many of them went to settle in England, where Henry rewarded them with lands and castles, and this would breed resentment amongst the established courtiers in England about the supposed influence of the Poitevins. Meanwhile, Henry attempted to use diplomacy to strengthen his position relative to the French, and cultivated an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in the mid-1240s, hoping that the German king could apply pressure on Louis to return some of England's former territorial possessions. It was wishful thinking, and by the end of the 1240s, Henry's position in France was no better than it had been for England at the height of the crisis under his father. So, who was the man who had emerged as King of England in his own right by the 1240s, after spending so many years in the shadows of the Regency government and figures such as Desroches? There are no contemporary descriptions of Henry's appearance extant, an omission which would at least suggest there was nothing unusual about how he looked. Examination of his remains in the 19th century revealed him to be about 5'6", an average height for the time, and of a strong build. Many contemporary observers claimed that Henry was a simple man, almost naive in some ways, but certainly not possessed of the character flaws of his father, which had created so many problems at the start of the 13th century. Unlike many of those who had preceded him and those who would succeed him as King of England, he was a largely peaceful man, one who did not entirely shy away from war, but who certainly did not revel in it. Indeed, the king's reputation for being a sanguine and uncomplicated character spread far and wide, and we even find the great Tuscan poet Dante Alighieri writing about it. Yet Henry's sanguinity could have its pitfalls, and there is no doubt that the reason it took him so long to begin to rule himself was due to his overly modest character and desire to please others. Henry was a highly religious man and patronized the church accordingly. His contemporary, the Benedictine chronicler Matthew Paris, related that the king honored many religious festivals by fasting on bread and water and dressing in plain woolen garments. Moreover, he was especially fond of going on pilgrimage to some of England's foremost religious sites, such as Walsingham and St. Albans. In the 1240s, he is said to have provided charity to upwards of 500 poor people every day, while he often provided for orphans and made considerable donations to England's religious houses for them to build hospitals and other charitable institutions. Indeed, it has been suggested that Henry was the greatest patron of the friars in late medieval England. The monasteries, nunneries, and other religious institutions of orders such as the Dominicans, Franciscans, and Carmelites at Canterbury, Oxford, Reading, York, and Shrewsbury were nearly all built at his expense. Finally, he was especially devoted to St. Edward the Confessor, who, like Henry, had been an orphan. He chose Edward as his role model, and it was his imagery which he attempted to conjoin to his own in a gold penny which was produced in England in 1257, a clear statement of his piety and religious sensibilities. Henry was also a considerable contributor to England's cultural heritage. In the realms of literature, his personal tastes were somewhat simple. For example, from a roll of the time, we learn that his reading material was a great book of romances. Moreover, although his reign witnessed the emergence of many notable medieval English thinkers, amongst whom the Franciscan philosopher and early scientist Roger Bacon is especially notable. Henry was not a major patron of such individuals. However, his influence on art and architecture was considerable. For instance, he developed the Tower of London considerably and even added an early menagerie or zoo there, complete with an elephant, leopard, and camel. He completed the most significant development of Windsor Castle prior to the massive building work undertaken by Edward III there a century later. But his most notable accomplishment in this sphere was at Westminster, by that time the traditional inauguration site of the Kings of England. Here, Henry spent tens of thousands of pounds on expanding Westminster Palace and Westminster Abbey. In particular, the Lady Chapel, which he built at Westminster, was a grand undertaking which began during his regency and which appears to have only been finished 30 years later, in the 1250s. The 1250s also saw a shift in Henry's approach towards England's Jewish population. As we saw earlier, Henry's government had attempted to introduce a policy of conversion in the 1230s, but this was largely based on persuasion, and for Henry, this was done on the basis of his personal piety. He seems to have genuinely believed that he needed to save the Jewish people of England from damnation if they adhered to the wrong religion. By way of contrast, in the 1250s, a more coercive approach to conversion was adopted. In 1253, the Statute of Jewry was implemented. This introduced various measures designed to make it difficult to practice Judaism in England. For instance, henceforth it was declared that no new synagogues could be constructed. Jews were also to be confined to living in their own designated communities or ghettos, and they had to wear badges of identification to indicate they were Jewish. Other elements aimed to make Jews conform to Christian social practices, for instance, by banning Jews from eating meat during Lent. Thus, the 1250s saw a growing persecution of England's Jewish population, one which would culminate in their expulsion from the country in the subsequent reign. Just months after the passage of the Statute of Jewry, a new course was decided upon for Ireland as well. The English presence in Ireland was nearly a century old by that time, the conquest of the island from its dozens of independent Irish lords having been first started by Henry's grandfather Henry II in the 1170s. By the mid-13th century, much of the island had been conquered, although significant parts of Ulster in the north, Connaught in the west and Munster in the south remained in the hands of the Irish lords. In 1254, Henry decided to grant his eldest son and heir presumptive Edward the title of Lord of Ireland, on the condition that the Irish territories would not be separated from the Crown's English dominions. Thereafter, the English presence in the country continued to grow, as adventurers such as the first Baron of Desmond, John Fitzthomas, made large inroads in acquiring lands from the powerful MacCarthys of Munster. As a result, by the end of Henry's reign, the English lordship was nearing its peak in Ireland, and the period of Henry's reign and those of his immediate successors constitute one of the few times in England's tortuous entanglement with Ireland that the English exchequer actually benefited from Ireland, rather than having to send subsidies to Dublin. Ireland was not the only thing impacting the inflow of monies into the English exchequer in the 1250s. Several major reforms of the English coinage were also undertaken around mid-century. The first of these in 1247 was a recoinage which was introduced across England, Ireland and Wales, whereby the old silver coins bearing a short cross were replaced by a new silver coin with a long cross design on them. When managed efficiently, such recoinages, whether in medieval or early modern times, could produce a significant financial windfall for the government, and this was no exception. Following on from this, Henry, whose financial position was extremely precarious during the regency governments of his youth, was believed to have had a stockpile of money to fall back on should the need arise, which it would, when fresh political crises arose towards the end of the 1250s. However, A move to introduce further fiscal reform in 1257 by introducing gold pennies, which were becoming popular in the Mediterranean trading ports of Venice, Pisa, and Genoa in Italy at the time, proved less successful than the earlier reform of the silver coinage, and was ultimately abandoned when the merchant community of the City of London complained that the new coins were overvalued. Early in the 1250s, Henry became embroiled in the politics of the Kingdom of Sicily in southern Italy. This part of Italy had been conquered by the Normans during the course of the 11th and early 12th centuries, but it had passed into the possession of the Hohenstaufen royal line in Germany in the late 12th century. As a consequence, the long-serving Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, had ruled Sicily since 1197, albeit in an unstable way, and both the Norman lords and the papacy to the north in Rome had perennially interfered in Sicilian affairs. Rome was particularly anxious to increase its influence over southern Italy at a time when it was in regular conflict with the Hohenstaufens, with their enormous influence over Germany. As a result, when Frederick died in 1250, the Pope in Rome, Innocent IV, moved to block the accession of a new Hohenstaufen candidate to the throne of Sicily and began looking for a more biddable ruler who would defer to the papacy in matters there. He soon concluded that Henry's younger son Edmund would make a good candidate, and Henry was inclined to proceed with this plan. Viewing Sicily as a good base from which he could develop his long-held plan to lead a crusade to the Holy Land, like his uncle Richard the Lionheart had done so memorably in the late 12th century. After years of negotiations, Edmund was at last dispatched to Italy in 1254, and was soon invested as King of Sicily by Pope Alexander IV, who had succeeded to the papacy in December 1254. Thereafter, Edmund began his efforts to dislodge the Hohenstaufen candidate Manfred from the Kingdom of Sicily and impose his own claim. Yet this soon ran into trouble, where Innocent IV had granted Henry large loans to aid him in building an army that could support Edmund's claim. Alexander IV was much more financially cautious, and within months of his accession was actually demanding that Henry began repaying the money Innocent had loaned to him. But Henry, whose reign was still dogged by financial difficulties, was unable to pay back anything near the £90,000 which Alexander was demanding. The king turned to Parliament for financial assistance, but was rebuffed, and eventually could only gather about £40,000 by reappropriating large amounts of the English Church's revenues in the mid-1250s, with Alexander threatening excommunication if Henry did not repay him fully. The effort to militarily support Edmund's claim to Sicily was abandoned in 1258, following which Alexander revoked the grant of the kingship to Edmund. Thereafter, Manfred was crowned as King of Sicily at Palermo in August. The Sicilian business had proved a costly failure for Henry, one which contributed substantially to a new political crisis which swept England in the late 1250s. The Sicilian business was just the latest in a series of events stretching all the way back to the Santonge War and the early 1240s, which had exacerbated feelings towards Henry amongst his English nobles. There was an increasing belief that Henry was reckless in his spending habits, and that this was weakening the kingdom. Additionally, his supposed favoritism towards his Lusitano relatives from Poitou stirred up resentment amongst his English subjects. Now, this disillusion boiled over in 1258 into outright opposition by the English barons and some of the French lords like Simon de Montfort, who had long called England their home. These were led by de Montfort and the Earl of Gloucester, Richard de Clare. At a parliament in the summer of 1258, this opposition group forced Henry into agreeing to the so-called Provisions of Oxford, whereby the Lusignans were all but expelled from any positions of influence, and the government was placed in the hands of 15 councillors who were to be selected by the leading magnates and nobles of the realm. These were supplemented by the more radical provisions of Westminster in 1259, which now had the support of Henry's own son and heir, the Lord Edward. The net result of all of this was that in the late 1250s, Henry lost much of the autonomy that he had governed with since the mid-1230s. There now followed a period of Magnate rule, during which the English aristocracy formulated policy for England. Henry did not acquiesce entirely with this new dispensation. Rather, he tried to maneuver himself back into a position where he could confront his nobles. To that end, he decided on a revolutionary move in relation to France. At the end of 1259, he and the Queen left England and headed to Paris. Henry's goal was to negotiate a peace treaty with King Louis, whereby the long-running disputes over respective jurisdictions could finally be resolved. Although it was anathema to much of the English political community, Henry agreed with Louis that he would relinquish his claims to the former English territories in the north of France which his father had lost half a century earlier, most notably the Duchy of Normandy. In return, Louis agreed to acknowledge Henry as the rightful Lord of Gascony and the surrounding territory in the southwest of France, which the English still held. Louis would also provide diplomatic and financial assistance to Henry in his dispute with his nobles back in England. With this newfound support from Paris, Henry was able to return to England in 1260, and by late 1261, he had taken control once again by exploiting divisions which would emerge between de Montfort, de Clare, and Edward. This done, de Montfort was exiled to France, and the king reconciled with Edward. But the situation remained precarious, and a further outbreak of unrest never seemed far away. While Henry had reasserted himself during the course of 1261, the tensions which had brought about the emergence of opposition in 1258 remained largely unresolved. The Poitevins continued to hold some influence over the king, and Henry's effective surrender of his claims to England's former possessions in northern England had not been welcomed by some of the English barons. Moreover, while Edward had been reconciled with his father, Simon de Montfort remained a problem for Henry, even from his exile in France. Thus, when in April 1263 it was learned that de Montfort had crossed over the Channel and was back in England, it was a cause for great concern. Doubly so, because de Montfort had returned at the urging of large numbers of the English nobility, who were convinced that Henry would not alter his style of governance unless he was directly challenged. In the weeks that followed, de Montfort began gathering a new opposition movement around him at Oxford. By the autumn of that year, there were armed clashes occurring in western England between Henry's supporters and those who sympathized with de Montfort and the other barons. When de Montfort then marched on London, civil war seemed imminent yet again. The conflict, which has become known as the Second Barons' War, broke out as a result of the events which transpired in London in the autumn and winter of 1263. When de Montfort arrived there, Henry could do little to prevent him taking control of the government, but he did use his son Edward to build up a faction of support amongst the lords to counter de Montfort. With a stalemate developing between the opposing sides, it was determined that King Louis IX of France would be asked to act as an arbitrator in the dispute between Henry, de Montfort, and the English nobles. Yet, de Montfort cannot have predicted what would occur. In January 1264, the French king, who had been selected for the role of arbitrator as he was recognized as a monarch with an innate sense of justice, issued a ruling called the Mise of Amiens, in which he effectively sided with King Henry and proposed the annulment of the earlier provisions which had been agreed at Oxford and Westminster in 1258 and 1259, whereby the English magnates would effectively appoint Henry's consulates. There were now only two options for de Montfort and his followers. They could accept defeat, or they could enter into outright rebellion. They chose the latter, and the Second Barons' War commenced. The conflict which developed now took many forms. Clashes broke out again in western England while de Montfort began promoting violence against the Jewish community, claiming that many of the financial problems being experienced across England were on account of huge debts owed to Jewish moneylenders. This inflammatory rhetoric caused several pogroms to be committed against Jewish communities across England. However, the main quarrel lay between de Montfort and the king. Eventually, the two sides clashed at Lewes in Sussex in mid-May 1264. Here, Henry had encamped at St Pancras Priory as he waited for further reinforcements to join him there. Henry had as many as 10,000 men with him when the cavalry detachment under the Lord Edward was added in. De Montfort approached Lewes with a smaller contingent, perhaps as little as 5,000 men, but his original design was to negotiate with Henry, not engage in combat. However, when Henry spurned his offer of a parley, de Montfort attacked on the 14th of May. The Royalists initially appeared to win the battle that ensued, but an over-enthusiastic pursuit of the baronial army by Edward and his cavalry left Henry and his troops badly exposed. As a result, de Montfort's men succeeded in capturing Henry's brother Richard. Daunted by this success, Henry effectively surrendered to de Montfort. In the aftermath of Lewes, Henry was forced to conform to the earlier provisions of Oxford of 1258, whereby baronial rule was imposed. Thus, after this first stage in the Second Barons' War, Henry was left as little more than a figurehead, with de Montfort triumphant. This situation lasted for the majority of the next year. However, in May 1265, almost exactly a year after the defeat at Lewes, Edward, who was in de Montfort's custody, escaped and quickly began assembling his own army. A major victory was scored early on when he won over Gilbert de Clare, a leading member of the baronial opposition to the king's courts. On the 1st of August, they attacked de Montfort's troops near Kenilworth Castle. This was enough to force de Montfort to move to engage Edward. The head of the baronial movement humiliated the aging king by bringing him along to witness the battle in a suit of borrowed armor. But what Henry actually ended up witnessing was the end of de Montfort's cause. At the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265, Edward's superior forces defeated de Montfort's in Worcestershire. Both de Montfort and his son Henry were killed in the fighting, while the king himself was liberated after 15 months of effectively being de Montfort's prisoner. The Battle of Evesham left the Royalists in a dominant position in the Second Barons' War, although sporadic fighting continued in some places. To bring it fully to an end, in 1266, Henry issued the Dictum of Kenilworth, which indicated that former rebels would be treated leniently, while the Statute of Marlborough the following year formalized this agreement and brought the Second Barons' War to a conclusion. The last years of Henry's reign and the aftermath of the Second Barons' War was similar to the majority of his reign in that Henry tried as best he could to stabilize things in the face of many challenges. To the west, Henry's councillors negotiated the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267 with Llewellyn at Griffith. Through this, Henry acknowledged Llewellyn as the Prince of Gwynedd, but Llewellyn agreed to pay homage to the king as his liege lord. It was not a perfect arrangement from the English perspective, but it stabilized the western frontier for several years before a resurgence of English power there in the subsequent reign. Within England itself, there was a prevalence of brigandage and lawlessness in many parts of the country in the late 1260s, which Henry's officials tried their best to quell, though they were limited in the resources afforded to them, as Henry was still working to pay back the debts he had accrued in fighting the war with de Montfort. On the fiscal front, the king's situation was made difficult by the decision of Edward in 1268 to lead the Ninth Crusade to the Holy Land, an endeavor which required further taxes to be raised from a nation which had been unwilling to provide the same for decades. Similarly, Henry tried to temper the anti-Jewish sentiments which de Montfort had done much to stoke, but his efforts in this respect were not very successful. There was one notable moment which Henry could savor in the last years of his life. Work on expanding and redeveloping Westminster had commenced decades earlier when Henry was a young man. Now, in late 1269, the work there was officially recognized when Henry oversaw a vast celebration in which the relics of St. Edward were borne to the shrine at Westminster. For Henry, whose piety and religious devotion was clearly very genuine, it was surely a high point on a personal level. Shortly afterwards, he saw his son, Edward, off as he left to undertake the crusade that Henry had intended to embark on many times himself, but had never been able to. It was the last time he would see his son. In March 1271, Henry, who was 63 years old and entering old age by the standards of the time, fell seriously ill. He recovered sufficiently to be able to rule in some fashion for the next year and a half, but he was quite debilitated and could not attend several funerals, notably that of his 5-year-old grandson John. Henry died at Westminster on the 16th of November 1272, shortly after his 65th birthday. He was buried at Westminster, although he was re-entombed in 1290 by Edward in a grander tomb at the Abbey. Though Eleanor wished for him to be canonized, he never was. But the grand edifice of Westminster Abbey today stands as a testament to him. Henry was succeeded by his son and long-serving heir, the Lord Edward, who now became King Edward I. Despite his waywardness in the late 1250s, Edward had been steadfast in his support of his father since. He was still engaged in the Ninth Crusade to the Holy Land, the last major initiative to help the doomed Christian states there, before the fall of their last stronghold at Acre in 1291, as his father became ill in England. Edward was on his way home from the Holy Land in 1272 when he learned of Henry's death. The new king, nicknamed Longshanks for his height of 6'2", ruled in stark contrast to his father. Where Henry had tried to avoid war, Edward embraced it, bringing Wales firmly back under English rule in the late 1270s and into the 1280s. Thereafter, he set about trying to conquer Scotland in a complete abandonment of Henry's amicable stance towards England's northern neighbour. Yet, at home, Edward's policies largely reflected those of his father. The objective was to try to continue to restore royal authority after the crises of both Henry's, and in particular, John's reign. He also went one step further in ordering the complete expulsion of the Jewish community from England in 1290. Thus, Edward's reign constituted both a new departure and the effort to expand English control throughout Britain, and a continuation and intensification of some of Henry's domestic policies. Despite the duration and significance of his reign, Henry III has typically been a marginalized figure in English political history. To a degree, this is because of his reign occurring in between a large number of monarchs who were not necessarily more successful than Henry, but were certainly more colorful. For instance, Henry's uncle Richard the Lionheart made little impact on England itself during his relatively short reign, but has captured the imagination of the British public owing to his role in the Crusades to the Holy Land. Additionally, Henry's own father, John I, is a very prominent English monarch of the late Middle Ages, but this is largely because of how poor his rule was, and the fact that his heavy-handedness inspired his nobility to press for the signing of the Magna Carta, a seminal episode in English constitutional and political history. Then, Henry was overshadowed following his reign by that of his son Edward I, who largely completed the conquest of Wales and temporarily brought Scotland under English rule. Finally, Henry's great-grandson Edward III initiated the 100 Years' War with France and is often perceived as one of England's greatest monarchs. Sandwiched between these rulers, some of them very good, some of them very bad, Henry III has largely been forgotten amongst the ranks of England's medieval kings. But how should we judge Henry III's reign? There is a strong argument to be made that it was a disaster. To begin with, once he came of age in the 1220s, Henry failed to assert himself for many years and allowed Hubert de Burgh and then Peter Devroche to build up their own factions, which dominated the government. Then, when he finally managed to begin to rule in a personal capacity, he still allowed too many French outsiders to influence affairs in England, whether those who arrived with his wife from Provence, or later his mother's Lusignan relatives from Poitou. On the international stage, he failed to reconquer Wales. He succeeded only in reinforcing the loss of Normandy and other territories in northern France under John, and his effort to establish his son, Edmund, as King of Sicily was a complete failure. Moreover, all of these disastrous initiatives cost huge sums of money for a monarchy that was not in a good financial position when he became king. Eventually, his seeming preference for outsiders and his reckless squandering of money led many of his own nobles to try to drastically curtail his power, a move which eventually ended in the Second Barons' War. All of this clearly seems to suggest that Henry's reign was a long exercise in failure. And yet, there is another way of perceiving Henry. Many of the challenges he faced throughout his reign were inherited from his father, notably the querulous nature of the crown's relationship with England's nobles and the military situation in Wales. While Henry did not lose the Duchy of Normandy and other territories in northern France, John did that, and in 1259, Henry simply reached an agreement with Louis of France, which acknowledged that the French had held those lands for over half a century. At that point, by way of contrast, Henry succeeded in remaining at peace with Scotland throughout his long reign and fixed the English-Scottish border in a way which has largely endured down to the present day. There can be no doubting that Henry was disastrous when it came to money, but his feelings were not the same as John's. Where his father was a distasteful character who created many of his own problems, Henry was a pious man who wanted to spend his time erecting religious buildings and honoring the saints. The last thing he wanted was confrontation. It was simply his misfortune to be King of England for half a century during a time when he simply could not avoid it. What do you think of King Henry III? Is he one of England's most underappreciated monarchs? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Hello guys, the People Profiles and the History Chronicles have joined forces, so as well as the fantastic long-form documentaries you get here on the People Profiles, the team are also producing short-form documentaries on the History Chronicles, on everything from knightly orders to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as well as a range of biographies from history's best, worst, and most interesting people. Check out the link in the video description, subscribe, and thanks for watching.